All right, I'm back. I apologize about the framing. I'm kind of having to make a little mock setup to hold things, and I can't exactly see how well framed I am, but I'm going to talk about some of the training now that I'm actually training here. Just doing a little work down in the basement with some of the free weights I have. But there's a few things I wanted to touch on. I guess the first thing I want to initially introduce is this concept of waste. And everyone's heard of wasted reps, wasted sets. And it is something to keep in mind in this context. It's something that in a lot of other times you would hear it discussed. It's overblown. It's something you can kind of ignore. For the average gym goer, the concept that your extra effort in there is somehow going to take away from your potential in the other things you are trying to accomplish in the gym is kind of nonsense unless you are pushing yourself to an ungodly threshold. But it's rarely the case. But in the context of this neurological adaptation focused strength training, the concept of waste is absolutely something that has to be kept in mind. You are trying to design your entire program around this principle that you want to maximize neurological driven adaptations through that exercise while minimizing metabolic demands, which means trying to avoid wasteful reps and sets. Now, what does that exactly mean? Let me give an example here. So I have a very narrowed goal at the moment, which I think will help with illustrating a lot of this stuff as we talk about it in future videos. I'm still trying to compete in the super heavyweights and strongman as my primary goal in strength sports, but I have noticed that I might have an opportunity to maybe test myself a little in the strict curl, as it's something that I do excel in compared to a lot of people at my body weight, and it is something that I would like to try to qualify for the Arnold's Nationals competition for. So I would like to do a qualifying competition for that soon and try and place off numbers alone, which I think is rather reasonable for me at the moment. And so my training right now, to summarize it as best I could, if I could, would be I want to focus on neuromuscular adaptations that contribute to the strict curl while also trying to preserve the capacity I have in strongman. I don't want to be focusing on strongman in that sense, because that would be a waste. If my primary goal right now is to drive the neurological adaptations for the strict curl, that everything else falls into the secondary focus for me. And everything else is going to be, to some extent, a waste. Now, not everything is as wasteful as everything else, and to some degree you still want to engage in this waste if you're someone like me where you want to maintain general conditioning and to not become hyper specified in something. So let me give an example right now of what that could look like for lift selection. I want today's workout to still be a relatively full body comprehensive workout, but I want the primary focus, of course, to be neurological adaptations of the muscles involved in the strict curl. Now, one might just assume that's just the biceps, understandably so. Apologies if you hear my cat in the background. Snoop, be quiet. But it is actually a lift that heavily utilizes the traps. To a degree, uses the upper back in its entirety, but definitely in regards to stabilization. I'm just gonna calm him down a little. But definitely in regards to stabilization, your upper back is critical. The traps come into a crucial role in the initial portion of the lift. I will demonstrate what I am talking about by showing a wrong and right rep for the strict curl. Right now, this isn't a strict curl. My back is not against the wall. This would not be to competition standard at all. But if you are just using your biceps, it's going to look an awful lot like this. Now, you can still explode up on just your biceps, but you are rather limiting yourself when you can start the motion using your traps, removing a lot of the initial lift you're going to have to do by giving yourself some momentum, and then carrying over to the bis. Your traps have a greater capacity for strength and to hold a greater load than your biceps ever will, at least for most people. And so you can definitely drive a greater capacity to explode by focusing a little bit on your traps. So this is not the lift I'm trying to talk about. I'm just trying to demonstrate the strict curl here, using it with your traps versus just the buys. With the traps, just the buys. It is so much easier for me when I get that initial momentum using the traps, starting the lift. It is definitely more technical than I think a lot of people would imagine, and that's something you definitely want to focus on, is the technical aspects of any lift if you're trying to go down this route. So what I wanted to get to though for lift selection, for my first exercise, I want to choose something that's rather comprehensive for a warm-up. I want to choose something that's still rather focused on the muscle groups I'm trying to prime right now. And so I might do something like hang cleans. I might do something like power cleans, or maybe something like power shrugs. We'll start out with some power shrugs here. So I'm using an easy curl bar still. You should probably use a straight bar for this kind of stuff, but I just don't want to switch around plates. And we're going to be moving into some strict curl stuff with the easy curl bar at the end here, but power shrugs, for those not familiar, is something prominent in Olympic lifting, a sport that as well is very dependent on neurological adaptation, especially in the lighter weight classes. I mean, that is the primary driving factor on who wins and who loses. But power shrugs would be coming up into a deadlift and continuing through with a shrug in one continuous motion. So the end position of the lift is shrugged, starting from the floor. So you are driving far more with your traps in this lift than you would a traditional deadlift. So that is a way to emphasize the muscle groups and limit waste. Another concept for limiting waste would be trying to minimize slow reps, or I guess not necessarily minimize slow reps because it's sport dependent, but at the very least, if you are in a sport where explosivity is a key factor, definitely focusing more on having, including your warm-up sets, most of your reps be fast, explosive reps. Your system adapts to what you give it. Your body will become more proficient with quick reps if that is the majority of what you do. Your body will become more proficient with slower reps if that is the majority of what you do. I am not, however, trying to say do not utilize time under tension, do not do slow reps. That is not what I'm trying to encourage. They absolutely still have a value even in these types of programming. You will still have periods. You should periodize your training that you're trying to focus more on muscle growth. That is just going to be a secondary aspect of your periodization though. The primary chunk should still be focused on strength adaptation through neurological adaptation. So there is still a place for time under tension and focusing on growth. It's absolutely a thing that it has better impacts on muscle growth from a size and mass standpoint to utilize time under tension and slower reps. And if your goals are hypertrophy related, at least acutely, then definitely try and still include them in your training, as well as being able to control a rep. Slow reps is what will drive skill acquisition, at least in the early phases, better. When you are still trying to learn a lift, you want to do it slow. You want to be able to make those adjustments moment to moment with a little bit of thought and to program that into your brain, into your body. And that is something that will require time to be able to speed up. So if it is a new lift to you, do not jump into doing it fast to just avoid waste. A new lift that you are rather confident is hard to mess up, I would say, is fine. So things that have rather limited injury risk, specifically, isolation movements that are locked into specific fixed positions. So things on machines that don't take you through the full range of motion and that you aren't maximally loading off the start are kind of fine to try to approach like this, where you're focusing on fast reps right off the get-go. But for the vast majority of the things that you're going to do in your training, that's not the case. What you should be focusing on for the bulk of every session is doing a lot of compound lifts, a lot of multi-joint movements. You want to have the time be effective and the stimulus be effective with a minimal amount of additional fatigue. Had to pause there, but to get back to where I was, you would want the majority of your lifts that you select in your training to be compound multi-joint movement lifts. You want the time to be efficient, of course, and that's part of the reason you're choosing that, but you also want it to have, sorry, the cat's going nuts right now. You also want it to have the most carryover to what you do in terms of events. So for somebody like me, where I am focused on being a more skill-acquired strongman than my counterparts and potentially less strong than them, I want to have a wide variety of lifts that have carryover to a wide variety of other lifts. I want the majority of my lifts to be things that have broad, ubiquitous carryover to everything, essentially. So something like what I mentioned before, doing the hang cleans, the reasons why I choose that. I mean, in strongman, the hip hinge is a critical aspect of the sport. Being able to pull things up overhead for throwing events. I mean, the clean and clean-like movements carry over a lot into that. And in addition to just selecting specific lifts that have carryover, you want to have a variety. So I wouldn't just do cleans as my means of preparing for a throwing event, an overhead throwing event like the sandbag toss. If it was something I had to train for, I would be doing every single compound lift that has a broad degree of carryover to it as my training. And that might, to some people, sound problematic and counterintuitive, and it is. It is something that is much harder to plan proper linear progression for. I am somebody that trains off of feel. I have a degree in kinesiology, and I've been doing this for a decade, so I know my body pretty well. I know some of you are also kind of in the camp where you can coach yourself pretty effectively, but for the average person, I would say this is something that is going to require a little bit of outside guidance for being able to do this. You might want to have a training partner that's more familiar with the gym than you are, but you won't be tracking linear progression necessarily the way other people would, where you have one specific lift like the bench that's going to carry over to all presses that you are trying to mainly progress on in your strength building session. You are going to do bench, overhead press, incline press, push press, and everything that has some sort of carryover to it back and forth. And so you will have less of a chance to build up specific strength in that one lift. You are, however, building up the skill components of all of those lifts by switching back and forth. You are becoming more prepared to adjust between different types of presses, and very adaptable by doing that. So it's definitely one of those things. This mode of training requires you to keep in mind its limitations at all times, because it was definitely a lot easier for me to feel like I was getting stronger in my early days, where I was, just focused on bench, squat, deadlift, row, overhead press, the kind of main, very strict, non-moving lifts that have a lot of carryover to these things, but it did not carry over in the same way to being able to jump into random moving events that I've had no experience with and be able to do well on, which is now something that I almost feel is my specialty. So there is a big perk to being this flexible in your training, in that you're flexible on the field. So that's kind of the gist of what I wanted to go over with the waist aspect. I'm going to pause for now, do a little bit of lifting, and get back to you guys in a second. All right, while we're talking about waist, yes, this looks stupid, but I am the king of weird lifts and stupid shit to accomplish what I'm doing. You guys are going to see a lot of that throughout. But let's talk about accessory movements. They have a place still, but they are by and large wasteful in most contexts. Where do you want to still include accessory lifts? If you are a strength-focused athlete and not a aesthetic-focused athlete, the things you're going to want to focus on the most are the weakest links in your kinetic chains that are most typically used for your sport. So now, in the context of the strict curl, I struggle the most at finishing the lift. This final portion, getting it to your chest. My traps, my buys are both pretty strong. My weakest link is just finishing it off. And so that's what I'm doing right now. This is kind of some downtime between sets that I wanted to recover. And this is what I would be doing as my accessory work, as a way to more efficiently use time as well. It's a little bit of time I can kind of recover from harder sets and still do something in the in-between while focusing on what is the weakest link in my chain. So I've got I think it's a 50-pound band, I don't even know, but it's wrapped around my arms twice here, and just finishing off that lift. And you'll notice there's not exactly a real range of motion to this lift. It is barely moving. But that's my point. Accessory lifts probably in this context are going to be both, more often than not, like shorter range of motion lifts, and they're going to be things that you are still doing to a heavier degree, so limited rep ranges. It's not to say that'll be the only context these things are used in, but again, the goal is to minimize waste. This is how you are minimizing waste. All right, so I decided to actually warm up a little, and so it's just going to be the 45 and 25 here, but we're going to demonstrate a proper simulation strict curl is what I'll call it, because I'm not going against the wall in the basement. I don't really feel the desire to do any damage to this house, so at least while I'm training in the basement, you won't see any proper strict curls. But a simulation strict curl here while standing will involve using those traps to start the lift and continuing off with the buys. That last one got a little cheaty, which is what I'm going to get into. The next set I intend to do entirely as a cheat set. And there might be people cringing at the thought of cheat rep strict curls or cheat rep curls, but when you're training for neurological adaptation, you're going to do a lot of things that seem contrary to the norm. This is a way of loading the nervous system at key points in the lift and loading the skeletal muscular system at key points in the lift with a greater load than I would be able to achieve just performing the lift normally. So you're still putting it under that level of tensile stress at moments without actually requiring to be able to lift that much. Now, cheat reps can get risky. I'm not saying to just go into every exercise and make it ugly. But if you are smart about making reps ugly, they can have a real value. So cheat curls for training for the strict curl, when you are trying to drive neurological adaptations as your primary focus, make a lot of sense. They don't need to be the bulk of your training, but they should be included as an added component for sure. So let's demonstrate some cheat curls here. So you're seeing I'm swinging my hips a lot, using a lot of leg drive, sometimes even kind of coming up on the tippy toes. Definitely involving more of the body than would be in a strict curl. There are, however, moments in the lift where the majority of what's being used is just the muscles involved in the strict curl. That is stimulating that same end effect that we are looking for while limiting the amount of muscular fatigue that would be needed to drive that. It's the end of what I wanted to talk about because I want to actually train, and trying to talk and train at the same time is hard for me. So I'm going to take a break here. I'll catch you guys later. All right, I lied. I want to record one more thing. I talked earlier about how I'm the king of doing weird shit for my training goals, so I figured I would include this at the end here. One of the things that is critical to strongman is grip strength. I try to include grip components in just about every session of training. So even though right now my goals are more strict curl related than my normal general strongman goals are kind of falling right now, I do still want to include what I view as the critical aspects of the sport for me to continue to develop as core parts of my training. So I'm going to have a handful of sets doing my weird little pulls with uneven weights. It totals up to 220 pounds. A couple different kettlebells here, 4 of them here, all different weights. And I got them strapped together on 2 different straps so I can switch position and switch how the load kind of feels and falls. I rotate around, so switching between reps, there is a lot of inconsistency in this. I mean, the load is still technically the same every time by the time I get it off the ground, but how much is lifted at one point in time versus how much is lifted in another between 2 reps can be very different. So it keeps things interesting and keeps the stimulus dynamic, and also it's just a lot of fun. So I've got these shitty little plastic straps. And you'll see I'll just keep rotating around it, going back and forth, arm to arm, doing a hip hinge to lift it. My floor is even a little uneven, which I think I would encourage you guys probably to not replicate. I'm not intentionally doing this, but given the sake of what I'm talking about, it does keep things dynamic. I would say keep a flat floor, but I'm on shifting levels of carpeting here, which probably not the smartest thing to do. So this is something I'm treating like a general conditioning thing too, since it's one of the last exercises of my session. Unlike the other exercises prior, I'm going to be training most of these sets to failure, whereas in just about every other exercise prior, unless it is a near maximal attempt or some sort of PR attempt for volume, you won't see me pushing towards failure that often. I definitely leave a few reps in reserve intentionally because of that concept of wasted reps we were talking about and your body becoming accustomed to what you do. I don't want to do too many slower reps and add too much additional fatigue. I want to get the max I can out of that set without adding too much constraint to myself after. So that usually involves, for the at least general sense of training, most of my sets being not to failure. This I'm just going to keep going 1 rep after another. Some candles here. Sorry if I'm getting further and further out of frame here. And this is also something I decided to include today because outside of training grip, it is a good trap exercise too. I mean, I'm basically just doing the last portion of a deadlift.